The mysterious encounter. It was a dark and quiet night on the planet of Firaxis, a world that had seen little human presence. The air was thick with humidity, and the trees swayed in a wind that was both warm and unsettling. The planet's surface was a jungle of unknown dangers, where life thrived in ways the human race could barely understand. For weeks, a small human squad had been trying to survive on this strange planet, waiting for a chance to gather enough information before their extraction. But things had gone wrong, and they were now stranded. Among them was Sergeant James Harlan, a soldier who had seen it all: dangerous terrains, deadly creatures, and the harsh reality of war. But nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to face. James trudged through the dense underbrush, his boots squelching with each step. His rifle was slung across his chest, his eyes scanning the shadows. His comrades were spread out, forming a loose perimeter around their small camp, but something felt wrong. The planet was silent. Too silent. He felt it before he saw it, the presence of something, or someone. A strange energy in the air, like static on the edge of his senses. His heart rate increased, but he kept his cool. He was a soldier, after all, but this was different. He wasn't sure what he was feeling, but it wasn't a normal threat. Suddenly, through the thick foliage ahead, he caught sight of something unusual. A figure, tall, but hunched, and wrapped in dark cloth that shimmered strangely in the moonlight. His eyes narrowed, and instinctively his hand tightened around the rifle. The figure stepped forward, moving silently like a shadow. Then it paused. James held his breath. It was no animal. This was something different. The shape before him slowly straightened, revealing the full height of the figure. The cloak fell back, and for a moment, James thought he had seen a ghost. It was a woman, but not like any woman he had ever seen. She was taller than most humans, her skin pale with a faint iridescent glow that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of her breathing. Her hair flowed down like strands of liquid silver, shifting with every movement she made. And her eyes, those eyes, were unlike any human's. They glowed with an unnatural, piercing light, and James felt a chill run down his spine when their gaze met. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice rough with tension. His heart raced, but his military training kicked in, and he stood his ground. The woman's lips parted, but instead of speaking, she made a strange sound. It was a soft, melodic noise, like a song, but foreign, alien. She raised a hand, and James froze. He didn't know why, but something about her presence made him hesitate, like an invisible force was pressing against him, urging him to stay still. She studied him with curiosity, as though she were trying to make sense of him, just as much as he was trying to understand her. Her expression was calm, but there was an underlying tension in her posture. It was like she was fighting to keep control of something, perhaps fear, or perhaps something darker. The air around her seemed to shimmer with power, and James couldn't help but wonder what kind of being she was. "Are you?" he began, his voice barely above a whisper. He couldn't finish the question. The word alien hung in the air between them, but he couldn't bring himself to say it aloud. The woman tilted her head slightly, as if she understood his unspoken question. She stepped closer, her movements graceful and fluid. James instinctively took a step back, his hand tightening on his weapon, but he didn't raise it. He was too stunned, too confused by what he was seeing. His mind raced. This could be the key to understanding the planet. Could this be the alien princess everyone had heard whispers about? For a long moment, neither of them moved. It was a standoff, but not one that felt like a fight. No, it felt like a test, of wills, of patience, of understanding. The princess's eyes, glowing softly, never left his. James felt a strange pull, an almost magnetic force. He wanted to understand her, but the fear of the unknown held him back. Without warning, a voice crackled through his earpiece. "Harlan, what's going on? Report." It was Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, his commanding officer, breaking the silence. "Stay back," James hissed into his comm, not wanting to alarm the princess. "We've got something here. I need backup. Now." The voice from his earpiece hesitated, then replied, "Understood. We're sending reinforcements, but be careful, Harlan. We don't know what we're dealing with." James didn't respond. His focus was entirely on the woman before him. She took another step forward, her presence growing more intense with each passing second. Then, in an unexpected move, she reached out a hand, palm open. James tensed, ready to fire if necessary, but he stopped himself just in time. The woman's gesture wasn't threatening. It was inviting. The air between them felt charged, as though they were connected by some invisible force. He stood frozen, unsure of what to do. His training told him to defend himself, to remain cautious, but something in his gut told him this was different. This was not a typical enemy. The woman's eyes softened, and she spoke again. This time, her words slow, deliberate. They were unfamiliar, but the tone of her voice was calming, almost soothing. James didn't know what she was saying, but it didn't matter. In that moment, he realized that he wasn't facing just any alien. This was something far more important, something that could change everything. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, the woman stepped back. Her eyes locked with his one last time before she turned and disappeared into the shadows of the jungle. For a moment, James stood still, unsure whether he had imagined the encounter. His heart was still racing, but now it was filled with more questions than answers. He was no longer sure what he had seen or what it meant, but one thing was clear: this encounter had only just begun. The mysterious alien princess had made her presence known, and now nothing would ever be the same. First impressions and misunderstandings. The jungle around Sergeant James Harlan remained eerily quiet, its thick foliage whispering under the faint wind. His breath came in shallow, quick bursts as he tried to process what had just happened. The alien princess had vanished into the shadows, leaving him standing alone, his pulse still pounding in his ears. He turned in circles, trying to make sense of it all, but the planet seemed as unsettling as ever. His earpiece crackled again. "Harlan, report in. What's going on out there?" Lieutenant Mitchell's voice was sharp and urgent, filled with concern. I don't know, Mom," James replied, his voice shaking slightly. "I just saw something. A woman. An alien, maybe. She didn't attack, but she's unlike anything I've ever seen." Mitchell's voice was calm, but still laced with tension. "What do you mean, unlike anything? Give me details." James took a deep breath, trying to steady his mind. "She's tall, pale skin, long silver hair. Her eyes, they glowed like nothing I've ever seen before. She seemed calm, almost like she wasn't even worried about the situation. I didn't feel threatened, but there was something about her that made me uneasy. I couldn't quite place it." "Understood," Mitchell said. "Keep your distance, Harlan. I'll send a team to support you. We'll need to investigate, but be careful. Don't engage unless necessary." "Copy that," James muttered. He still wasn't sure what had happened. The encounter had left him with more questions than answers. Who was this alien princess? Why had she appeared to him? And what was that strange connection he'd felt in the moment when their eyes locked? It was as though some unseen force had drawn them together, and he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the last time he would see her. Shaking off the unease, James moved cautiously through the jungle, hoping to find his team. The air felt thick with tension, the atmosphere heavy with the weight of the unknown. His thoughts kept drifting back to the woman he had seen. Her presence was both captivating and unnerving. Meanwhile, the alien princess was far from the soldier's mind, but she was no less troubled. She had retreated to a secluded area, her heart racing in her chest. The encounter had been unexpected, and she struggled to keep her emotions in check. Her people, the Zephyrians, had long been isolated from the galaxy's many races. She had never expected to find herself on a human world, let alone to meet a human soldier. Her thoughts were scattered. The soldier, James Harlan, had been unlike any human she had heard about. There was a calmness to him, a controlled aggression she couldn't quite place. But it wasn't just that. She had sensed something deeper, something that made her question everything she thought she knew about the humans. She had seen many species during her time as a princess, but the human race, with all its contradictions and unpredictability, was something she had yet to understand fully. She had watched them for a while, from the shadows, learning about their wars, their technology, their survival instincts. But now, face to face with one of them, she felt something different. Her instincts screamed at her to keep her distance, to remain hidden. But there was another part of her that urged her to understand. The Zypherian people were not known for their mercy, but this soldier, this human, was different. She could sense his hesitation, his confusion, but also his strength. Perhaps this meeting, this chance encounter, was meant to happen. As she stood alone in the shadows of the jungle, she reflected on her mission. She had been sent to this planet as part of an ancient pact, a diplomatic mission to discover what lay beyond her homeworld's borders. The humans were a new, raw threat. She could feel it, but she had not expected to encounter them in this way. Meanwhile, James had found his team, who had gathered at a small clearing near their last camp. His mind was still heavy with the sight of the princess, and he found it hard to focus on the conversation around him. The soldiers spoke in hushed tones, discussing their next move, but all James could think about was the strange encounter. "You're quiet, Harlan," said Private Miller, a younger soldier who had joined the mission only recently. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." James didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked over at his team, his eyes scanning the dense trees, half expecting the alien princess to emerge from the shadows at any moment. But there was nothing, only the rustling of leaves in the breeze. "I saw something out there," James finally said, his voice low. "A woman. She wasn't human. I don't know what she was, but she didn't seem like a threat." The team fell silent, their gazes locked on him. Lieutenant Mitchell raised an eyebrow. "A woman? What do you mean, not human? Are we talking about one of those creatures from the reports?" James shook his head. No, this was different. She was calm. Too calm. It didn't feel like we were facing an enemy. "Are you sure?" Mitchell pressed. "You know better than anyone that appearances can be deceiving. Don't let your guard down." James nodded. "I know, ma'am. But there was something about her, something strange. It didn't feel like a normal encounter. She didn't attack. She just disappeared." Mitchell studied him for a moment, her brow furrowed in thought. "All right. We'll stay alert, but we don't know what we're dealing with. Keep your eyes open, Harlan, and don't make contact again unless you have to." James didn't answer. His mind was elsewhere, his thoughts tangled around the princess he had met. He knew there was more to her than met the eye. Something in her seemed to be reaching out to him, even if she didn't realize it. She was different, and that made her more dangerous in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. The night stretched on, and the jungle around them seemed to grow even darker. But James couldn't shake the feeling that the alien princess was out there, watching, waiting, and he couldn't help but wonder, would they meet again? And when they did, what would happen? Unlikely alliance forms. The night passed in uneasy silence. The team made camp on the edge of the jungle, surrounded by the thick trees and dense underbrush of Firaxis. James lay on his back, staring up at the sky, the soft rustle of leaves above his head failing to soothe his mind. His thoughts were consumed by the alien princess, her pale skin, glowing eyes, and the strange, almost magnetic presence she had. The way she hadn't attacked, had only watched him with curiosity. He couldn't shake it. He had dealt with enemies before, but never like this. She had been different. Unlike any opponent he'd ever faced, she had not only appeared out of nowhere, but had also given him a sense of both awe and fear. "Hey, Harlan, you all right?" It was Private Miller, his voice breaking the quiet of the night. James turned his head, squinting into the dim light of the campfire. "Yeah, just thinking," he muttered. Miller sat down next to him, looking over at the fire before locking eyes with him. "You sure about what you saw? I mean, what if she's one of those alien threats? Maybe you didn't see her clearly, or—" James cut him off with a shake of his head. "No, it wasn't like that. I saw her. She wasn't like the others. She didn't act like an enemy. I don't know what she was doing out there, but something tells me we haven't seen the last of her." Miller looked skeptical but said nothing. They both turned their attention back to the campfire, the crackling flames casting eerie shadows across their faces. There was a palpable sense of unease in the air. James wasn't sure if it was just him, but the whole planet felt different now, as though something was watching, waiting. The following morning, the team moved out again, cautiously making their way deeper into the jungle. James kept his guard up, constantly scanning the trees, the foliage, the thick mist that curled through the air. He had the distinct feeling that they were being watched, but every time he turned, there was nothing. Only shadows and the whisper of the wind. Hours passed without incident, but the tension among the soldiers was growing. They could sense it too, the strange feeling that something was lurking just beyond their vision. That's when they saw her again. Through the mist, just on the edge of their camp's perimeter, there she was. The alien princess. She stood motionless, her silver hair cascading down her shoulders, her eyes glowing faintly in the morning light. This time, though, she wasn't disappearing into the shadows. She was waiting. James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. His instincts screamed at him to raise his weapon, to command his team to prepare for an attack. But the princess made no move to threaten them. She simply stood there, watching. This time, James didn't hesitate. He stepped forward slowly, cautiously, his eyes locked on hers. "I don't want any trouble," he said, his voice steady despite the tension rising in his chest. "But if you don't move, we'll be forced to defend ourselves." The princess didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, her glowing eyes studying him, as if she were trying to understand his words. Then, unexpectedly, she spoke, not in the foreign melody from before, but in rough, halting words. "Not enemy," she said. Her voice was strange, her words broken and uncertain. But there was no mistaking the meaning. James blinked, unsure if he heard correctly. "Not enemy," he repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Then, what do you want?" The princess hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her gaze never leaving his. She extended a hand towards him, her fingers trembling slightly. James instinctively stepped back, but something in her gesture stopped him. There was a sense of sincerity in her movement. She wasn't asking for a fight. She was offering something else. "Help," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, the world seemed to stand still. The soldiers behind James tensed, their hands hovering over their weapons. But James wasn't focused on them. His eyes were fixed on the princess. There was something in her that spoke of desperation, of fear, of a need he couldn't ignore. James swallowed hard, his mind racing. She wasn't attacking. She wasn't demanding anything from them. She was asking for help. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why come to us? Why us?" The princess didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked past James, as if she were searching for something in the distance. Her gaze shifted, and James noticed the faint flicker of something in her eyes, something darker. It was a fleeting glimpse, but it was enough to make his heart race. "We are hunted," she said, her voice stronger now, though still fractured. "My people, they send to kill." James frowned, trying to make sense of her words. "Your people want to kill you?" he asked, confused. "You're a princess. Why would they?" "Not my people," she interrupted quickly. "Others. Enemy. Pursue me. Want. Power." She closed her eyes briefly, and for a moment, James saw something akin to fear in her gaze. It was fleeting, but real. James stood there, his mind whirling with the implications. This wasn't a simple encounter. This wasn't just some alien attack. Something far deeper, far more complex, was at play here. And somehow, despite everything that told him to be cautious, he couldn't bring himself to turn her away. "All right," he said after a long pause, his voice steady but unsure. "We'll help you, but we need to know more. You need to tell us everything about who's after you, why you're here, and why we should trust you." The princess nodded slowly, her expression softening. She lowered her hand, but her gaze never left his. "I will tell all," she said quietly, "but we must hurry. They come." The weight of her words hung in the air. James didn't need to ask who they were. It was clear now. Her enemies were closing in. And now, in the jungle of Firaxis, a human soldier and an alien princess were forced to rely on each other in a fight against unknown forces. James took a deep breath, the decision made. This was no longer just a mission of survival. It had become something far more dangerous. But if there was one thing he knew, it was that there was no turning back now. "Let's move," he said to his team, his voice commanding. "We've got work to do." And together, they began the dangerous journey into the heart of Firaxis, where they would face the hidden threat that hunted the alien princess. Struggling against the environment. The jungle of Firaxis was a place of contradictions, beautiful yet brutal, teeming with life yet brimming with danger. The dense foliage hung low above their heads, a tangled mass of thick vines, giant ferns, and trees with bark that seemed to pulse with an energy of its own. Strange, glowing insects flitted through the air, their tiny bodies lighting up like fireflies. It was a world of alien beauty, but one that could easily kill you if you weren't careful. James and his team had been moving through the jungle for hours now, their steps cautious, the sound of their boots muffled by the soft undergrowth. The princess walked silently beside them, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, alert to any signs of danger. She had yet to reveal much about herself or her people, but her presence had already begun to shift the dynamics of the group. No longer were they a team of soldiers navigating a hostile world. They were now protectors of someone who might hold the key to a new chapter in the galaxy. But with that responsibility came a weight none of them were ready for. The air was thick, pressing down on their chests, making every breath feel like it took twice as much effort. The humidity was suffocating, and despite the heavy sweat clinging to his uniform, James couldn't shake the sense that they were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every shifting shadow, made him tense. They were far from the relative safety of their crash site, deep into the unknown, and that unknown felt increasingly hostile with every passing moment. "How much farther?" Miller asked, wiping sweat from his brow as he fell in step beside James. "We don't know," James replied, scanning the thick foliage. "She said they were close. Whoever is after her, stay sharp." The princess, who had remained mostly silent since their uneasy alliance was formed, slowed her pace and glanced at James. Her eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, reflected something he hadn't noticed before. There was a quiet determination in her expression now, something that wasn't there when they first met. She wasn't just running from her enemies anymore. She was preparing to fight. But even as she steadied herself, James could sense her fatigue. Her pace had slowed slightly, her shoulders slumped, and the weight of her silence spoke volumes. She was struggling. James turned to her, noticing her labored breathing. "You okay?" he asked, keeping his voice low. The princess nodded without speaking, but her gaze was distant. She looked beyond James, into the jungle, her eyes fixed on some invisible threat. It was as if she was seeing something he couldn't. James watched her for a moment before looking back at the team. The soldiers were in no better shape. The constant humidity made it nearly impossible to stay dry, and the heat was becoming unbearable. But there was something else, something that weighed on them all. The princess was clearly in pain, but she wasn't showing it. She was holding back, pushing forward as if every step took everything she had left. "We need to find shelter," James said, turning to the team. "The sun is setting soon, and the jungle gets even more dangerous at night." He didn't need to say more. The team had already learned the harsh realities of Firaxis. Even now, the jungle felt like it was closing in on them. Strange, whispering noises came from the darkness beyond the path they were walking, and something in the trees seemed to move, out of sync with the breeze. The tension in the air was thick, oppressive, and no one wanted to be caught out in the open when the creatures of Firaxis came hunting. They made their way toward a small clearing James had spotted earlier, hoping it would provide some cover. As they neared the clearing, the princess suddenly stopped, her eyes widening. James immediately went on high alert, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "What's wrong?" The princess pointed toward the clearing. "It is there," she said, her voice low, almost a whisper. James squinted into the distance. At first, all he saw were the dark silhouettes of trees and the underbrush. But then his eyes picked out something strange. In the center of the clearing, there was an odd structure, a mound of dirt and broken branches, an unnatural formation that didn't belong in the otherwise organic environment. It was too symmetrical, too intentional. "Get down," James ordered, his voice urgent. The team dropped to their knees, weapons raised, every sense on high alert. They all watched, their breath shallow, as the princess moved cautiously toward the edge of the clearing. She was no longer the confident figure she had appeared to be earlier. Her every movement was measured, slow, as if she were afraid of something even worse than the jungle itself. "It's a trap," she muttered, barely audible. "They know I'm here." A chill ran down James's spine. Who were they? The enemies the princess had mentioned. Were they tracking them somehow? Suddenly, a deep rumbling sound shook the ground beneath their feet, and the air seemed to vibrate with energy. James instinctively raised his rifle, scanning the area. Then, from behind the mound, something began to emerge. At first, it was barely visible, but then it became unmistakable. A creature, massive and grotesque, crawled into view. Its body was covered in thick, armored plates, like a moving tank. Its face was a mass of twisting, spiny tendrils, and its eyes glowed an unnatural shade of violet, shining through the gaps in its armor. Its legs were short but powerful, designed for speed and crushing power. The creature's presence was menacing, and the jungle seemed to fall silent in its wake. The soldiers held their breath, weapons aimed at the creature. The princess, however, did not flinch. She stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "That's one of them," she said softly, her voice full of pain and resolve. "One of my enemies." James could feel the tension rising in his chest. This was no longer a simple survival mission. It was now a fight for their lives, with a creature from the depths of Firaxis' darkest corners ready to tear them apart. The princess had known this would happen. And now, they were facing the horrors of the jungle head-on, with no choice but to stand and fight. "Get ready," James said, his voice low but firm. "We fight together, or we don't fight at all." The battle had begun, and with it, the real struggle for survival in this alien world had only just started. The hidden enemy. The massive creature that had crawled from the depths of the jungle loomed before them, its glowing violet eyes scanning the team like a predator assessing its prey. Its armored body creaked with each movement, like the sound of metal scraping against stone. The ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight, and its breath came in short, sharp bursts, thick with the scent of decay and fear. James gripped his rifle tighter, sweat trickling down his brow as he stared down the beast. It was far larger than anything he had encountered before. Its massive claws curled into the soil, leaving deep gouges in the earth. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. This wasn't just a creature of Firaxis. This was something else, something purposefully placed in their path. "They know we're here," the princess murmured, her voice low but steady. She stood in front of the team, her eyes locked on the creature, her body tense, but her posture strong. She wasn't backing down. "Who are they?" James demanded, his voice harsh with urgency. "Who's hunting you? What is this thing?" The princess turned slightly, her gaze never leaving the creature. "This is a Korath. It hunts not only for food but for sport. The ones who control it, they are the Vorin, an ancient enemy of my people. They have been tracking me since I fled my world." James's mind raced. Vorin. He had never heard of them, but there was no mistaking the fear in the princess's voice. This wasn't just some rogue alien. This was a part of something much larger. And now, the threat was closing in. The Korath shifted, its massive form rippling as it advanced, its clawed legs digging deep into the soft earth. It hissed, a sound like the rustling of dry leaves, mixed with a deep growl, its mouth opening to reveal rows of razor-sharp teeth that gleamed with menace. "Stay calm," James ordered his team, keeping his voice steady. "We need to get back to the clearing. We can't fight this thing out in the open. Fall back." Without waiting for a response, James motioned to the soldiers, signaling them to move quickly. The team began to retreat in a tight formation, weapons aimed at the Korath, as they carefully moved toward the dense underbrush. The Korath, however, was relentless. It let out a terrifying screech and lunged forward, its massive form moving faster than James would have expected. "Move!" James shouted again, and the team broke into a sprint, the sound of their boots pounding against the jungle floor mingling with the crashing steps of the creature behind them. The princess, however, did not run. She stood firm, watching as the Korath barreled toward her, its fanged maw snapping open and shut. "Get out of the way," James yelled, but the princess remained unmoving. Instead of fear, there was a quiet resolve in her expression as she stepped forward, her body brimming with a strange, almost supernatural energy. Her eyes glowed brighter now, her hands clenched into fists, and a low hum began to vibrate in the air around her. It was as though the very atmosphere had changed, bending in response to her presence. The soldiers paused in their retreat, frozen by the sudden intensity of the moment. The Korath reached her, its massive claws slashing through the air. But with a flick of her wrist, the princess raised her hand, and a brilliant wave of energy shot from her palm, slamming into the creature with a force that sent it stumbling back. The Korath screeched in pain, its armored body buckling under the invisible force. The ground trembled with the power of the impact, sending a cloud of dirt and debris into the air. James's eyes widened in disbelief. "What? How did you?" "She's not just an alien," Miller whispered, his voice filled with awe and fear. "She's a warrior." The princess didn't answer. Instead, she stood there, her body still radiating that strange, otherworldly energy as she faced down the creature. The Korath, stunned by the unexpected attack, hesitated, its glowing eyes now locked onto the princess with what could only be described as anger. Slowly, it recovered, its thick legs pushing against the earth, its massive body returning to an aggressive stance. "Stay back," the princess said quietly, not looking at the soldiers but sensing their hesitation. "I will deal with this." James didn't know whether to be impressed or terrified. This wasn't just a woman. This was a being with powers he couldn't comprehend, powers that seemed to shape reality itself. He had no idea what the princess was, but in that moment, it became clear they were no longer just fighting for survival on a hostile planet. They were fighting against forces much larger than they had ever imagined. The Korath charged again, but this time, the princess raised both arms, her fingers crackling with energy. She thrust her hands toward the creature, and a barrier of shimmering light enveloped the Korath. The beast roared as it slammed into the invisible wall, its claws scraping against the force field. But the more it struggled, the brighter the barrier became, its energy intensifying with each failed attempt to break through. The soldiers stared, mouths agape, as the Korath slowly began to retreat, its glowing eyes narrowing in confusion and frustration. It finally turned and began to slink away, disappearing back into the depths of the jungle from where it had come. The princess's energy gradually faded, and she dropped her arms, her breathing heavy but controlled. For a moment, there was only silence. Then James spoke, his voice unsteady. "What just happened? You stopped it." The princess turned toward him, her expression unreadable. "They will keep coming. The Vorin will send more. This Korath was just one of many." "We're not prepared for this," James muttered, shaking his head. "What are we dealing with here?" "You are dealing with more than you realize," she replied, her voice tinged with sadness. "My enemies, the Vorin, they seek to take what is mine. My world, my people. They want to harness the power of my bloodline. They will not stop until I am dead." The weight of her words hit James like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were caught in the middle of a war that wasn't their own, but one that had now dragged them into its chaos. And the deeper they went into the jungle, the more dangerous the situation became. "Then we fight," James said finally, his voice resolute. "We fight with everything we have." The princess nodded. "You don't know what you're up against, but I will help you understand. But we must move quickly. There is no time." With that, they began moving once more, deeper into the jungle, knowing that the true enemy, the Vorin, was still out there, waiting. But now, they weren't just trying to survive. They were fighting for something far greater than themselves, and the stakes had never been higher. A dangerous decision. The air around them grew heavier with each step, the jungle of Firaxis seemingly closing in, the dense trees and thick underbrush pressing against their path. The princess, though still moving forward with purpose, had begun to show signs of fatigue. James could see it in her slow, deliberate movements, her eyes no longer glowing as brightly as before. She had pushed herself to the limit in the battle against the Korath, and it was clear she wasn't fully recovered. "How much farther?" James asked, keeping his voice steady despite the gnawing worry in his chest. He had never seen someone, let alone an alien, use that kind of power and not pay for it. The princess glanced at him, her silver hair cascading down her shoulders, her face pale but determined. "We are close," she replied, her voice tinged with exhaustion. "But we must be cautious. The Vorin will not send only creatures like the Korath. They will come with greater strength with their soldiers, and they will use the land itself against us." James nodded, his mind racing. They were getting closer to whatever it was that the princess was hiding from, but at what cost? They were already in over their heads, and it felt like they were stumbling toward a confrontation they weren't prepared for. He had no idea what the Vorin wanted, but it was becoming clear they were no mere invaders. They were hunters, and they had a plan. The jungle around them seemed to grow darker, the thick canopy above blocking out the last remnants of daylight. The team's movements grew more cautious, their weapons drawn, eyes scanning every corner of the dense foliage. But despite the danger, there was an unease growing among the soldiers. It wasn't just the threat of the Vorin anymore. It was the feeling that they were running out of time. Time to figure out exactly what they were up against and time to make the right choice. "Where are we headed?" Miller asked, his voice low. "We haven't exactly been given the full story yet." James shot him a sharp look. "Now's not the time for questions. We stick together. We keep moving." Miller frowned, but didn't argue. He knew as well as anyone that survival came first. The princess, however, seemed to notice the underlying tension. She stopped abruptly, her gaze sweeping over the group. "I know you have questions," she said, her voice soft but commanding. "And I will answer when the time is right. But first, I must ask something of you, a dangerous choice." The words caught James off guard. He had seen the princess wield tremendous power, but there was something in her eyes now that made him pause. It wasn't fear, it was resolve. And yet, beneath that, there was something deeper, a burden, a weight of responsibility she had carried alone for too long. "What kind of choice?" James asked, his tone wary. She looked down at the ground for a moment, then raised her eyes to meet his. "There is a place ahead. A temple. My people once used it as a sanctuary, a place to gather our strength. But it is now corrupted by the Vorin. It is a trap, but it is the only place where I can gain what I need to fight back." James frowned. "You want us to go into a Vorin stronghold?" She nodded slowly. "It is the only place where I can access the Heartstone, a relic of my people's power. But it is protected. The Vorin have placed guardians around it, and once we enter, there is no turning back." The silence that followed was thick with tension. James's mind raced as he weighed the options. The Heartstone could give them an advantage, a chance to defeat the Vorin, but at what cost? The Vorin were already hunting them, and now the princess wanted them to walk straight into their lair. It was a dangerous gamble, a gamble that could easily cost them their lives. "We don't have the luxury of time," James said finally, his voice low but firm. "We need that power if we're going to have any chance of stopping them. We don't just need to survive. We need to strike back. If the Vorin are as dangerous as you say, this is our only chance." The princess's eyes softened slightly, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I did not ask lightly. The Heartstone can give us the power to push them back, but it is a double-edged sword. To use it, we must be willing to sacrifice something in return. The energy it provides is immense, but it takes as much as it gives." "How much?" James asked, his voice tight with suspicion. She hesitated, the weight of her next words hanging in the air. "It could take everything. Your energy, your life force. It could take all that you are." The soldiers exchanged uneasy glances, the gravity of her words settling over them like a storm cloud. This wasn't just about fighting. It was about risking everything they had. The princess wasn't just asking them to follow her into danger. She was asking them to make a sacrifice. James clenched his jaw, his thoughts a swirl of uncertainty and determination. He didn't have time to second-guess. The princess had already come this far, and so had they. There was no turning back now. If they had any chance of surviving what was coming, they had to act. And act fast. "How do we get to this temple?" James asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The princess's expression hardened once more. "Follow me. But remember, once we enter, there will be no turning back." The journey to the temple was a quiet one, the oppressive weight of their decision hanging over them like an invisible hand. The path grew steeper, and the jungle more treacherous. The soldiers moved cautiously, knowing that they were being guided towards something dangerous. But there was no other choice. The Heartstone could be their only hope. As they neared the entrance to the temple, a sudden sense of foreboding filled the air. The jungle, once alive with the sounds of alien creatures, had fallen deathly silent. The wind stopped. The leaves hung motionless in the air, as if the world itself had paused to watch them. The princess stopped at the entrance, her eyes fixed on the dark, jagged stone of the temple. It loomed above them, an ancient structure of twisted vines and jagged rock, half swallowed by the jungle over centuries of neglect. But there was something else, something darker about it now. The air around the temple was thick with an unnatural presence, something that made the hairs on the back of James's neck stand up. "This is it," the princess said softly, her voice barely a whisper. "This is where it all began, and where it will end." James swallowed hard. He didn't know what to expect, but he knew one thing for certain. They had crossed a line. Whatever lay ahead was no longer just a battle for survival. It was a battle for everything they had, and everything they were willing to lose. "We go in," James said, his voice grim but resolute, "and we make sure we don't leave without that power." The team nodded, preparing for the unknown. The final test had begun, the unexpected resolution. The heavy stone doors of the temple creaked as they pushed open, revealing the dark interior. The air inside was cool and still, a sharp contrast to the thick, humid jungle outside. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, alien symbols that twisted and spiraled, seemingly shifting as the light from their torches flickered. It felt ancient, as if the temple itself had been forgotten by time, waiting for something, or someone, to awaken it. James led the way, his rifle raised, his eyes darting across the darkened space. His team followed, their movements cautious but steady. The princess, now more composed than before, walked at the front with them, her silver hair trailing behind her like a ghost. She seemed more in tune with the space than anyone else, as if she was drawing strength from the very stones beneath their feet. "Stay alert," James muttered under his breath. "We don't know what's waiting for us inside." The princess's eyes flickered briefly toward him, a hint of sorrow in her gaze. "You will know soon enough. The Heartstone is here, but so are the Vorin." They moved deeper into the temple, the shadows growing darker, more oppressive. Every step seemed to echo in the vast, empty halls. The weight of the temple itself pressed down on them, the silence, almost suffocating. But there was something more, something in the air that made the hairs on the back of James's neck stand up. The deeper they went, the stronger the sense of dread became. Then, as they rounded a corner, they saw it. At the far end of the massive chamber, the Heartstone sat on a pedestal, glowing faintly in the darkness. The stone was not smooth or polished, but jagged, its edges sharp and uneven, as though it had grown from the very earth itself. It radiated an eerie, pulsing energy, an ancient power that hummed in the air, filling the chamber with a strange, almost magnetic pull. The princess stepped forward, her hand outstretched. But before she could move any closer, a harsh, mechanical voice cut through the silence. "Not so fast." James whirled, his rifle raised. From the shadows emerged several figures, tall, armored, and dressed in dark robes. The Vorin. They were as alien as the princess, but there was something more sinister about them. Their features were sharp, their eyes cold, and their presence oppressive. They moved like a well-coordinated unit, their weapons drawn, their focus entirely on the princess. "Flee now, and we will spare your life," one of them said, its voice cold and detached. "Return to your world, and we will allow it to live. But the Heartstone belongs to the Vorin." The princess stopped in her tracks, her gaze hardening. "You have no right to it," she replied, her voice steady but full of fury. "The Heartstone was never yours. It belongs to my people, and I will not let you have it." The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of the moment hanging over them. James felt it too. This was no longer just about survival. It was a stand, a final decision that would shape the outcome of everything they had fought for. The princess had made her choice, and now so would they. "We don't have time for this," James said, his voice calm but firm. He turned to his team, a look of determination in his eyes. "We fight." But before anyone could move, the princess stepped forward, her arms raised in a peaceful gesture. "No," she said, her voice quiet but forceful. "This fight will not end with bloodshed. Not here. Not now." The Vorin sneered, their weapons still pointed toward her, but they hesitated. The princess's voice carried an authority that silenced the room. James couldn't understand what she was doing, but in that moment he trusted her. "Let me," she said, her eyes narrowing. "I will face them alone." There was a heavy silence, and for a moment James thought the Vorin might make a move. But the princess was resolute. The room seemed to hold its breath. "You have nothing left to bargain with," one of the Vorin leaders said, a hint of annoyance in its voice. "The Heartstone is ours. Your people are gone. There is nothing you can do." The princess's eyes flashed with an intensity that took everyone by surprise. "You are wrong," she said softly, almost sadly. "My people live in me." With those words, she took another step toward the Heartstone. The energy in the room shifted. The Heartstone pulsed brighter, its glow intensifying as the princess's hand hovered above it. A crackling sound filled the air, as though the stone itself was awakening, responding to her presence. James's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew this wasn't just a simple transfer of power. This was something deeper. The princess wasn't just accessing the Heartstone. She was connecting with it, channeling its ancient energy into herself. The Vorin watched, their faces hardening with rage, but they did not move. There was something in the air now, something intangible that made them hesitate. And then, without warning, a wave of energy exploded from the Heartstone. It was unlike anything James had ever felt. Pure, raw power that washed over him, making his skin tingle, his bones vibrate. The air itself seemed to hum with an otherworldly force. The Vorin staggered back, their hands raised to shield their faces from the blast. For a long, heart-stopping moment, everything stood still. The room was bathed in a brilliant, glowing light, and for the first time since they arrived on Firaxis, James felt a sense of calm. It was as though the entire temple had come alive, responding to the princess's connection to the Heartstone. Then, as quickly as it began, the energy subsided. The room fell silent again. The Vorin, now visibly shaken, slowly lowered their hands. The princess stood before the Heartstone, her eyes glowing with the energy she had absorbed. The Vorin leader spoke again, this time with a hint of fear in its voice. You have unlocked its true power." The princess nodded, her voice unwavering. "And I will use it to protect my people. You will never have the Heartstone, and you will never harm my world again." The Vorin looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. They were no longer dealing with the same alien they had hunted. The princess had transformed into something far greater, something unstoppable. Without another word, the Vorin turned and retreated into the shadows from which they had emerged. The weight of their presence lingered, but they no longer posed a threat. The princess had won. James exhaled, his muscles loosening as the tension in the room dissipated. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected the princess to wield the Heartstone's power so fully, so completely. But now it was clear. She wasn't just an alien princess. She was a force of nature, the last hope of her people. "You did it," James said, his voice filled with awe. The princess turned to him, her eyes softening, but there was still a quiet strength in them. "We did it," she corrected, offering him a faint smile. They had faced the unimaginable and overcome it, but their journey wasn't over. The war was still out there, waiting. But for now, the Heartstone had brought them peace, and with it, the power to face whatever came next. Together, they had made an impossible choice, and together, they would fight for the future.